As the turn of the century came, President McKinley was assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt ascended to the presidency. Much like his predecessor, Roosevelt supported tariffs as a means of protecting both American industries and American workers. Roosevelt's stance was one of reform, and just as the Industrial Revolution allowed for the fulfillment of Hamilton's vision, its aftermath demanded that further steps be taken. Teddy Roosevelt addressed this by initiating a period of trust-busting, regulations protecting consumers and workers, and environmental protections via land conservation efforts. Towards the end of the Progressive Era, another boon for proponents of the American system came as President Woodrow Wilson, who, being a Democrat of that era, was actually largely opposed to the tariffs and subsidies that it promoted, nonetheless restored a national bank with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Another innovator in the American system was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like his relative and presidential predecessor, FDR's rise to power also spelt reform, only on an even larger scale. Elected in the midst of the Great Depression after an era of post-World War I market liberalization and the economic collapse which followed, FDR had little time for the economic abstractions of other post-war presidents. Instead, he pushed for federal intervention in the economy through jobs programs such as the Civilian Conservation Corps, industrial subsidies, farm subsidies, regulations via the newly created National Labor Relations Board and U.S. Department of Labor, and measures such as Social Security, which made it possible for the elderly to have something to fall back on in the case they didn't have savings for retirement. This ensured that industries would not totally fail and that the working class and poor Americans would avoid complete economic deprivation. Later, after the Second World War, there was a bit of a return towards the free trade of the 1920s, as the United States now had a position as the sole undisputed producer economy in the world. However, nonetheless, the government continued to engage in investments such as the interstate highway system, which was authorized by President Eisenhower, and many defense spending bills which were used to help bolster the American military in case of conflict with the rivaling Soviet Union. As the 1960s approached, the Vietnam War set a backdrop to a nation that's As the 1960s approached, the economic successes of the 1950s began to fade, and it became clear to many Americans that new measures needed to be taken in order to ensure a greater degree of social and economic stability. This manifested in the presidency of Lyndon B. Johnson and its Great Society program, which expanded welfare to include Medicare and Medicaid, among other measures. Additionally, in 1963, recognizing that the era of low tariffs had run its course and that America's European trade partners had substantially raised their own tariffs, President LBJ began to rein in certain free trade positions adopted in the 1950s. However, in the 1960s, there was also a growing undercurrent born out of the 1950s era of trade liberalization, which had been underway as publications such as the National Review and presidential candidates such as Barry Goldwater had begun to embrace a new approach to economic policy which broke with the old pragmatic policy. Neoliberalism and its counterpart neoconservatism had begun to take shape. A rebuke of the Soviet model, which had largely centralized the economy under a singular state authority, the new model borrowed from the Austrian School of Economics and was being further justified and advocated for by such economists as Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman. This approach rejected the notion that state intervention could genuinely be beneficial to the economy in the long run, and instead posited that the only economic model which would allow for greater prosperity was a profound liberalization of the market in a manner which had never truly been attempted before. With the ascendancy of Richard Nixon, this was implemented strategically, for example, in America opening up trade to China, which had been in the midst of a split with the Soviet Union. Nixon, however, was far from totally sold on this new basis for approaching economic policy, having also pushed for regulations on industry where it would have a clear benefit to the health and well-being of the American people. It was Nixon, after all, who founded the EPA and passed the Clean Air Act. The Reagan Revolution of 1980 might have been a more wholehearted embrace of certain principles behind this new model, with deregulation, deunionization, and market-based solutions being widely promoted. However, in the midst of the Cold War, this could still be to some extent justified in its own right. While the United States might not benefit from such measures directly, the disproportionate level of economic activity taking place in America and its partner countries in the West allowed them to surpass the Soviet Union, whose model had grown bloated and eventually incapable of sustaining itself. By the time Reagan left office, the collapse of the Soviet Union was an inevitability. After years of market liberalization becoming an increasingly dominant platform position for Republicans and increasingly Democrats as well, the modern paradigm began to take shape. The 1990s spelt a swift demise for the American system as freed trade was embraced at levels never before seen. America entered NAFTA and began slashing regulations across the board and cutting taxes and programs under the Republican administration of George Bush Sr. and the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton. By the presidency of George W. Bush Jr., neoliberalism became synonymous with capitalism, and calls to rein in its excesses were seen as an ancient and potentially socialistic machination of the previous century. Even after the 2008 banking crisis, which saw a massive recession due to deregulation, the new regulations put in place were mostly cosmetic, and trade internationalism continued to guide America's economic policy. Over the years, these policies had allowed for the hollowing out of a once bustling industrial steel belt as it deteriorated into what is now called the Rust Belt, and as jobs continued to be sent abroad, the election of 2016 became a year of unexpected populism, in which Bernie Sanders, a self-described democratic socialist, and Donald Trump, who ran his Make America Great Again platform, both proposed ending the full embrace of trade internationalism and market fundamentalism. Though the Trump presidency which followed did lead to the revival of some tariffs on Chinese goods and an end to the widely unpopular North American Free Trade Agreement, his domestic policy has lacked much of the focus on investments and subsidies which in the past has been used to jumpstart American industries. And now that former Vice President Joseph R. Biden has been elected, it seems that a full return to the neoliberalism of the Obama administration and its predecessors may be incoming. In evaluating how one might consider the merits of the American system, one has to understand it was not solely driven by protectionist, market interventionist, or subsidy-based dogma. Instead, it was driven by an understanding that a pragmatic solution to America's nuanced and changing economy was the only way to ensure that the government could best address the complexity of an ever-changing America. Neoliberalism may do wonders for American GDP growth. However, this is not the only measure of a nation's success. While GDP growth has occurred at astonishing rates, America's middle class has begun to hollow out. Wage increases have stagnated. The mass outsourcing of jobs to other nations due to a lack of protective tariffs has led to entire regions of America's working class being pushed out of their once family-sustaining jobs, and a lack of regulations has allowed for some predatory behaviors once cracked down on by President Teddy Roosevelt and FDR to reemerge in the modern economy. Understanding that America never had a truly free market in the literal sense of the term, and that a balance between the private sector and public sector has always guided the American economy, is critical. So too is understanding that the economy cannot revert to the past and the solutions of Senator Clay, President McKinley, or President Eisenhower. However, one can hope to emulate the approach to politics which was driven first by the independence of the American economy and well-being of the American people, rather than the dogma of politicians borrowing rhetoric from economists who, in turn, were reacting to the excesses of extreme models of government. A middle way is possible and has guided America through much of its history, through all of the trials and tribulations that America faced along the way. That system was the American system. Thank you for listening.